A distinct, undeniable divergence exists between the idealized mythology of the ancient Indian subcontinent and its actual physical reality. Ancient India produced a vast, complex corpus of literature, but unlike the Greeks or Romans, the authors of these texts did not write strict chronological history. They wrote grand epics, religious philosophy, and mythology. When the British East India Company took control of Bengal in 1765, they needed to administer Hindu civil law. In the late 18th century, they translated the Manusmriti to serve as a functional legal code. This administrative necessity locked historians into a text-first approach. For over 100 years, the written word was treated as the primary, unquestioned source material for understanding the ancient past. Colonial historians leveraged this literature to justify empire. Vincent Arthur Smith used early texts to paint India as a land accustomed to autocracy and despotism, concluding that the native population was entirely incapable of self-rule. The bias was explicit. In Smith's definitive 1904 history book, the brief, localized invasion by Alexander the Great occupied nearly a third of the entire text. Indian scholars, seeking to build a case for self-government, fired back using the exact same methodology. They combed through different ancient texts to present a counter-narrative, projecting modern democratic ideals backward to create the image of a flawless ancient utopia. Today, communalist historians push this text-first approach to its extreme, treating religious epics and mythology as literal, unquestionable historical facts. We cannot build an empirical timeline on literature written to serve a social agenda. To reconstruct the true sequence of events, historians have to invert the traditional model. The epics and Puranas must be subordinated to a strict hierarchy of physical, material evidence. A historical text is volatile when it lacks a single author and a fixed date of publication. This timeline shows the Mahabharata's compilation, spanning 1,400 years from the 10th century BC to the 4th century AD. The original Jaya started as 8,800 verses. Over centuries, generations added expansive, didactic interpolations, swelling the epic to 100,000 verses. Even the oldest existing texts, like the Rig Veda, carry interpolations, typically tacked on to the beginning or the end of the original compositions. When a text accumulates layers of narrative and didactic material over a millennium, assigning a specific year to any single event is impossible. Because these manuscripts were continually rewritten to validate the evolving social norms and political agendas of their times, they form the weakest possible foundation for a rigid chronological timeline. The alternative to the written word is the soil archive. Ancient settlements leave behind elevated mounds of earth. In a multicultural mound, successive civilizations build their cities directly on top of the ruined structures of their predecessors. Archaeologists read this archive through vertical excavation. By digging a lengthwise trench straight downward through the mound, they uncover a perfectly preserved sequence of material cultures, from the Kushan layer at the top down to the earliest painted grayware at the bottom. Vertical excavation establishes relative chronology. It proves which culture came before another. But to lock down the historical timeline, we need an absolute dating mechanism. That mechanism is radiocarbon, or C14 dating. All living organisms absorb the carbon-14 isotope at a steady rate through the air and their food. At the exact moment of death, absorption stops, and the radioactive isotope begins to decay. Because radioactive carbon decays at a strictly uniform rate, it acts as an internal mathematical clock. The half-life of carbon-14 is exactly 5,568 years. By measuring the remaining isotope, we extract a rigid empirical date. Stratigraphy determines the physical sequence, and radiocarbon dating provides the exact timestamp. Together, they create a chronological spine that literary sources cannot contradict. Between the organic material in the dirt and the mythology in the texts lie the middle layers of historical evidence: numismatics, the study of coins, and epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. Ancient India lacked paper currency. People stored their wealth in earthenware vessels, maintaining precious hoards archaeologists still unearth today. The physical distribution of these coins allows us to map the precise borders of ancient states. We can trace the exact regional circulation of the Indo-Greeks purely through where their currency was dropped and buried in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. The metallurgy tells an economic story. The sheer volume of gold coins minted during the post-Maurya and Gupta periods proves an explosion in global commerce. Conversely, the drastic reduction in minted currency discovered in the post-Gupta layers indicates a severe stagnation in trade. Above the coins are the inscriptions. Carved permanently into stone pillars, temple walls, and copper plates, these are the closest thing to primary historical documentation. For centuries, the earliest of these writings were unreadable. It wasn't until 1837 that James Prinsep, an East India Company civil servant, finally deciphered the Ashokan Brahmi script, providing access to records that had been indecipherable for centuries. Royal inscriptions do contain heavy propaganda, like King Ashoka inflating the casualty numbers of his conquests. But unlike a manuscript, a carved stone pillar cannot be secretly edited by a scribe 500 years later. They lock in the exact regnal years, the land grants, and the administrative decisions of the era, providing the hard data that mythology ignores. When we finally test the traditional text-based history of India against this new material hierarchy, stark contradictions emerge. The clearest example is the city of Ayodhya. Traditional Puranic genealogies and timelines confidently place the reign of Rama in Ayodhya at approximately 2000 BC. But when archaeologists conduct extensive vertical excavations at the physical site of Ayodhya, the soil archive tells a different story. The stratigraphic layers show no evidence of human settlement at that location around 2000 BC. We see a similar conflict with the timelines of Vardhamana Mahavira and Gautama Buddha. Accepted literary traditions place both of these religious leaders squarely in the 6th century BC. However, the specific cities these leaders are recorded as visiting do not appear in the archaeological record until 400 BC. The dirt demands that the tradition-based dates be reconsidered. Modern historians utilize an evidence matrix. Texts are valuable for understanding cultural norms, like the caste system, but for rigid chronology, they fail. For establishing dates, trade routes, and state borders, physical evidence reigns supreme. By enforcing this strict hierarchy of evidence, historians like D.D. Kosambi stripped away the demeaning myths of colonialists and the romanticized utopias of communalists. What remains is the true, complex, and empirically verifiable socio-economic evolution